December 21st, 1945. The phone call came into Dwight Eisenhower's office in Washington. George Patton was dead. For 3 years, Eisenhower had walked a political tightrope with the most controversial and effective general in the American Army. Publicly, he disciplined him. Privately, he relied on him. He defended him to politicians, apologized for him to allies, and restrained him when his aggression threatened to create diplomatic disasters. Now Patton was gone, and for the first time since the war began, Eisenhower no longer had to measure every word. What he said in the weeks and months that followed revealed something he had hidden behind careful diplomacy for years. Patton was not simply a good general. He was irreplaceable, and losing him felt like losing the most dangerous weapon the Allies possessed during the war. Long before Eisenhower became the supreme Allied commander in Europe and Patton became the most feared American general of the war, they were simply two young officers trying to change the future of warfare. In 1919, at Camp Meade, both men were captains in the newly formed Tank Corps. They spent long evenings together discussing engines, armor, and tactics. Both believed that tanks were more than just support weapons. They believed mechanized warfare would transform battle entirely. Fast-moving armored forces could break enemy lines, exploit gaps, and move so quickly that defenders would never recover. At the time, most of the United States Army dismissed these ideas. Senior officers still believed infantry and cavalry were the center of warfare. Tanks were viewed as experimental machines that supported foot soldiers. But Eisenhower and Patton were convinced the future belonged to speed and mobility. Despite their shared ideas, the two men came from very different worlds. Patton was wealthy, confident, and already a decorated combat veteran from the Mexican expedition and the First World War. Eisenhower was a quiet Kansas farm boy who had missed combat during the war and still carried the frustration of never proving himself in battle. Patton could afford to challenge authority. Eisenhower could not. He needed his military career. So where Patton spoke loudly, Eisenhower learned to speak carefully. Those differences would shape their relationship for decades. 23 years later, the two captains found themselves in very different positions. Eisenhower was now the supreme Allied commander in Europe. Patton had become the most aggressive field commander in the American Army. Their friendship still existed, but their roles had changed. Eisenhower now had to manage Patton, and Patton hated being managed. Patton believed war should be fought with speed, aggression, and relentless pressure. Eisenhower, on the other hand, had to lead a massive coalition of Allied nations. He had to balance American, British, and Soviet priorities. He had to think about diplomacy as much as military strategy. Every decision had political consequences. This difference created constant tension between the two men. Patton wanted to fight. Eisenhower had to think about the entire war. That tension would erupt repeatedly throughout the conflict. The most famous incident occurred in 1943 during the Allied invasion of Sicily. While visiting field hospitals, Patton encountered soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue. Today, we would call it post-traumatic stress. Patton saw it differently. He believed soldiers should endure psychological pressure the same way they endured physical wounds. In two separate incidents, Patton slapped exhausted soldiers and called them cowards. News of the incident spread quickly. Journalists learned about it. Politicians demanded answers. The American public was furious. Eisenhower now faced a painful decision. He could remove Patton from command and satisfy critics, or he could keep his most effective battlefield commander and risk a political disaster. Eisenhower chose a narrow path between those two options. He publicly reprimanded Patton. He forced him to apologize to the soldiers and medical staff. But he did not remove him from command, because Eisenhower knew something few politicians understood. The Allies needed Patton. By the spring of 1944, the Allies were preparing for the most important military, Operation of the War, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, Operation Overlord. But before a single soldier landed on the beaches of Normandy, Eisenhower faced a dangerous problem. The Germans were expecting an invasion. What they did not know was where it would happen. If German commanders concentrated their armies in Normandy, the landings could fail before they even began. The solution was deception, a massive intelligence operation called Operation Fortitude. The goal was simple: convince the Germans that the real invasion would take place at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. To make the deception believable, the Allies created an entire fake army. It had fake radio traffic, fake headquarters, fake supply depots, even inflatable tanks and wooden landing craft designed to fool German reconnaissance aircraft. And at the center of this illusion was one man, George Patton. German intelligence believed Patton was the most dangerous Allied commander. They had studied his campaigns in North Africa and Sicily. They knew his reputation for speed, aggression, and relentless pressure. In the German mind, if a major invasion was coming, Patton would lead it. Eisenhower understood that perfectly. So he placed Patton in command of the fictitious 1st United States Army Group, supposedly preparing to invade Calais. Patton inspected fake troops. He visited fake bases. He gave speeches that German spies carefully reported back to Berlin. Every movement reinforced the illusion, and the Germans believed it. Even after Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, German commanders hesitated to move their best divisions. They were convinced the real invasion would come later at Calais, led by Patton. For weeks, German forces remained in the wrong place. That delay saved thousands of Allied lives. It allowed the Normandy beachhead to survive the most dangerous stage of the invasion. But the plan came at a personal cost. Patton hated every minute of it. While other generals fought in Normandy, he was forced to play the role of a decoy. He wanted to lead soldiers into battle, not command an imaginary army. Yet Eisenhower understood something Patton did not. At that moment, Patton's reputation was more valuable than his presence on the battlefield. His name alone was helping win the war. Eventually, the deception phase ended. On August 1, 1944, Patton finally received what he wanted: command of the Third Army in France. What followed was one of the most astonishing military advances of the entire war. Within weeks, Patton's forces were racing across France. His tanks moved faster than German commanders could react. Entire defensive lines collapsed before they could fully form. French towns and cities were liberated in rapid succession. German soldiers surrendered by the thousands. Patton's army moved so quickly that supply lines struggled to keep up. Fuel became the greatest limitation. Patton constantly demanded more gasoline from Allied headquarters. He famously told Eisenhower that if he received enough fuel, he could be in Berlin within weeks. But Eisenhower had to consider the entire Allied front. Other armies needed supplies too. British forces under Montgomery were preparing their own operations. Political agreements with the Soviet Union also affected strategic decisions, so Eisenhower slowed Patton's advance. Fuel was redirected. Operations were coordinated more cautiously. To Patton, it felt like a terrible mistake. He believed the German army was collapsing and that the Allies should push forward relentlessly. Every delay in his mind allowed the enemy time to recover. Privately, Eisenhower sometimes wondered if Patton might be right. But as supreme commander, he had responsibilities beyond battlefield momentum. He had to manage the entire alliance, and that meant holding Patton back. The tension between them grew stronger, yet the moment of truth was still coming. December 16, 1944, without warning, German forces launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. The operation would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Entire American units were caught off guard. Defensive lines collapsed. Thousands of soldiers were surrounded. For the first time since the Normandy invasion, the Allies faced a serious crisis. Eisenhower quickly called an emergency meeting of his senior commanders in the French city of Verdun. The mood was tense. Many officers believed the Allies would need weeks to stabilize the front. Eisenhower listened quietly as the generals discussed defensive strategies. Then he turned to Patton. "George," he asked, "how long will it take you to attack?" Everyone in the room understood what the question meant. Patton's Third Army was currently facing south. To attack the German flank, he would have to pivot his entire army north. That meant redirecting tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of tanks, and thousands of vehicles across icy winter roads. It was an enormous logistical challenge. Most commanders would need weeks. Patton opened a small notebook. He had already planned for exactly this possibility. During the train ride to the meeting, he had quietly ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans. He looked up at Eisenhower and answered calmly. December 22nd, 3 divisions, 72 hours. Some generals thought the promise was impossible, but Eisenhower knew Patton well. He understood that Patton would not make such a claim unless he believed it could be done. "Make it happen," Eisenhower said. Patton delivered exactly what he promised. On December 22nd, 3 divisions of the Third Army slammed into the southern flank of the German offensive. The attack relieved pressure on surrounded American forces. Slowly, the German advance began to stall. What had looked like a potential Allied disaster turned into a defensive victory. In that moment, Eisenhower's long gamble on Patton paid off. All the controversies, all the political headaches, all the times he had defended or restrained his unpredictable commander. It was worth it, because when everything was falling apart, Patton did what no one else could. During the war, Eisenhower always spoke carefully about George Patton. Public statements were measured and diplomatic. He praised Patton's achievements but never elevated him above other commanders. He could not show favoritism. Eisenhower commanded an alliance, not just an army. He had to maintain the confidence of American generals like Omar Bradley, while also balancing the strong personalities of British commanders like Bernard Montgomery. Openly declaring Patton indispensable would have created political and military tension across the entire Allied command, so Eisenhower remained cautious in public. But privately, the story was very different. Inside staff meetings, Eisenhower often asked a simple question when reviewing operational plans. What would Patton do? He did not ask because Patton was always correct. He asked because Patton thought differently than every other commander. Where most generals saw obstacles, Patton saw opportunity. Where others carefully calculated risk, Patton calculated speed. He believed that momentum alone could break an enemy army. Eisenhower sometimes found that way of thinking invaluable. His personal notes from 1944 and 1945 reveal a constant struggle. He needed Patton's aggression, but he also had to restrain it. Patton could win battles quickly, but he could also create diplomatic disasters just as quickly. Managing him became one of the hardest parts of Eisenhower's job. Then the war ended, and suddenly Patton's greatest strengths became dangerous weaknesses. In wartime, his aggressive personality had been useful. In peace, it became a liability. Patton made controversial statements about former Nazi officials serving in local governments. He openly criticized Allied political decisions. At one point, he even suggested that the Western Allies should confront the Soviet Union. Those comments were explosive in the fragile political environment of post-war Europe. Eisenhower had little choice. He removed Patton from major command. It was one of the most painful decisions of his career. The two men had known each other for more than 25 years. They had built their military philosophies together. They had proven their ideas about mechanized warfare across the battlefields of Europe. Now their relationship ended in frustration and disappointment. Their final conversations were strained. Patton believed Eisenhower had betrayed him. Eisenhower believed he had no alternative. Then tragedy struck. In December 1945, Patton was involved in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. He suffered severe spinal injuries. For nearly 2 weeks, doctors attempted to save him. On December 21st, he died. For Eisenhower, the news brought an unexpected wave of reflection. The war was over. The political pressures had eased. For the first time, he could speak honestly about the man he had spent years managing. In private conversations, Eisenhower admitted something he had never said publicly during the war. Patton possessed a rare ability that could not be taught. He could achieve results through sheer force of will. Other generals relied on planning, organization, and careful coordination. Patton relied on speed, pressure, and relentless aggression. Eisenhower admitted that some of his decisions to restrain Patton had haunted him. He wondered whether giving Patton more freedom might have ended the war sooner. He also admitted something even more revealing. When chaos and uncertainty dominated the battlefield, Patton was at his best. When situations became unpredictable and dangerous, Patton thrived. Many commanders struggled in those moments. Patton seemed to become stronger. Eisenhower eventually summarized the entire relationship with a single word: indispensable. It was an extraordinary description. Indispensable meant irreplaceable. It meant that the outcome might have been different without him. Years later, Eisenhower included that word in his memoirs. He wrote that Patton was uniquely suited for war, but almost impossible to manage in peace. It was not meant as criticism. It was recognition that some individuals are shaped perfectly for certain moments in history. Patton was shaped for war, for speed, for shock, for breaking enemy resistance through relentless pressure. But when the war ended, those same qualities had nowhere to go. What had once been strengths became liabilities. Eisenhower understood that better than anyone, because for years he had been the man responsible for directing that power. Eisenhower later became President of the United States in 1953. He guided the country through the early years of the Cold War and led the nation for 8 years. He never again commanded armies in battle, but he never forgot George Patton. Even late in life, Eisenhower would sometimes speak about their early days at Camp Meade. 2 young captains standing beside experimental tanks and imagining how warfare might change. He remembered the difficult decisions of the war, the endless balancing act between politics and military necessity. And he remembered the moment at the Battle of the Bulge when everything seemed to be collapsing. The moment when he turned to Patton and asked if the impossible could be done. Patton's answer had been simple: 72 hours, and he delivered. In the end, Eisenhower's reflections were not just about Patton. They were about the burden of leadership itself. Command sometimes requires restraining the very people who make victory possible. It requires balancing effectiveness with diplomacy. It requires making decisions that will be misunderstood by friends and critics alike. Eisenhower had spent the entire war managing a man who was both brilliant and uncontrollable. Only after Patton was gone could he fully admit how valuable that difficult partnership had been. America lost more than a general in December 1945. It lost a man uniquely suited for the chaos of war, a commander who could make the impossible happen through sheer determination. Eisenhower had always known it, but only after Patton's death could he finally say it without consequences. So here is the question: should Eisenhower have given Patton more freedom during the war? Could a faster, more aggressive strategy have ended the conflict earlier? Or was Eisenhower right to restrain him for the sake of the alliance and the political balance of the war? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy deep historical stories about the friendships, rivalries, and decisions that shaped the world, subscribe for more documentaries like this. Because sometimes the most fascinating stories in history are not just about battles. They are about the complicated relationships between the people who fought them.